Hello, teachers. Good afternoon, everybody. Good afternoon or good morning or good evening, depending on where you're joining us from today. My name is Janine Matts. I'm an English language specialist with RELO. And as you can see today, our topic for the webinar is going to be working on writing, from planning to executing to evaluating. Welcome to everyone who is joining us live on Facebook. Hello, Flavio. Hello, Sofia Inés, Santi. Hello, everybody who's joining us from different parts of the world. Hello, Judith. Nice to see everybody here with us today. Okay, let's get started. Okay, so what are we going to talk about in today's webinar? A little bit of theory. We need to start with a little bit of theory to better understand why we do certain practices, right? We're going to talk about preparing to write. We're going to talk about the writing process and executing writing. And then we'll talk a little bit about evaluating, including peer review and writing rubrics. So let's start with a bit of theory. So writing is a process of communication, right? What do we do when we write? We express meaning through written language, but we always have an audience in mind. And this is something that's very important for us to remember. Writing is not done in a vacuum. Writing has a purpose and it is for some particular audience, right? So in L2 classes, by L2 we mean foreign language classes, right? Writing is usually considered a tool to produce language that displays the student's knowledge about the foreign language using target grammar and vocabulary, right? A lot of times as teachers, we tend to focus our writing around a specific vocabulary set or around a specific grammar structure. And sometimes we forget about the big picture of writing, right? We have to remember too that spoken and written language are very different. Good speakers of the L2 are not necessarily always good writers, and vice versa, right? Think about your own students right now. Think about some of the students that you know. I'm sure you can think of some students who are very good writers, but who don't speak as well, Or vice versa. Some of your students may be very fluent speakers, but their writing needs some work, right? So not always our best students are going to write and speak well. It's not always a given, right? An obvious point here is that reading is the best input for writers, and not only for a foreign language, but for our native language too. The more that we read, the better writers we become. Writing is a skill that improves with practice. So the more we practice writing, the better we become at writing. Just like the piano or like playing tennis, writing is a skill that also improves as we practice it. Yeah. But we need to ask ourselves a very important question as teachers. Can our students write in their first language? And I think that maybe the answer to this question for a lot of you is no, or at least they're not writing as well as they should in their first language. If our students don't have the mechanics and the techniques to write well in their first language, it's very difficult to expect them to write well in their second language, right? So we need to keep this in mind. Sometimes we need to work with the teachers who teach language arts in our institutions to see what kinds of problems they have with writing, yeah, so that we can work on them also in the foreign language classroom. Okay. I have on this slide here 2 shopping lists, okay? And what I would like you guys to do is take a look at these shopping lists, and I want you to take a moment. I'll be silent for about 20 seconds. And I want you to compare the shopping lists. Let's say that either I'm doing the shopping, I'm the one who writes the list, right? And I'm doing the shopping, or I send my sister to go do the shopping. Who is doing the shopping for each of these lists? We have the list on the left and we have the list on the right. Who is the shopper? Is it me or my sister for each of these lists? Think about it for a minute and determine what makes you answer that. So on the left-hand list, who is the shopper? Who is doing the shopping in this list? Let's think about it for a moment. In the meantime, I'm looking at some of your comments. Santi, I think you're completely correct when you say asking students to write in a foreign language becomes tough since they need to write in the L1 first. Absolutely, I agree. Yes, yes, yes. Henry's comment is also interesting. Like me, I'm pretty good at writing, but very bad at speaking. Nevertheless, I love teaching. Right. This is pretty normal because normally we have time to think when we write, right? So we have more time to reflect, to correct errors, mistakes, things like that. But when we're speaking, it's spontaneous and ephemeris. So we have to speak right away. We have to keep it moving. Yeah. So it's not surprising that a lot of you would be better writers than speakers. That's natural. Okay. So let's see. The left list we see it says bananas, cereal, milk, soap, and detergent, right? The right-hand list says 6 near-ripe bananas, Cheerios, regular, not honey, carton of whole milk, liquid hand soap, and laundry detergent if on sale, right? What do we notice is the difference between these 2 lists? What do we notice is the difference between these 2 lists? The fact that the one on the left is not very specific. It's very general, right? And the one on the right is more specific. So if my options of doing shopping are me or my sister, right? Who needs more specific instructions to buy my groceries? Who needs more specific instructions to buy my groceries? My sister, right? If I know what groceries I want to buy, all I need to do is write down a word so that I remember what groceries to buy, right? But on the other hand, my sister needs more specific instructions because she usually doesn't do the shopping for my groceries, right? So I have to give her more details in my instructions. I want this many bananas and I want them to be near ripe, not totally ripe, right? But I don't need to tell myself that in my shopping list because I know that in my head. Do you see? So what do we want to show here? What we want to show is that all writing is done for some type of audience, right? And we need to take into consideration who the audience is, who the target reader or readers is or are, in order for us to develop writing better, because we need to keep them in mind in order for us to best express ourselves through our writing, right? Depending on what information they may need, okay? So readers cannot negotiate meaning with the writer. So the writer must anticipate what the reader needs to know to understand the writing. This was a perfect example, right? Here's another example. I'm a linguist. If I'm writing something like a blog or something that, and my target audience is other linguists, I don't need to explain specific terminology like morpheme or coda or tonic syllable or something like this, right? But if my audience is, let's say, business people, and I'm explaining to them the basics of linguistics, I need to explain all of that terminology because they won't know what those words mean, right? So writers have a purpose for writing and a target audience. And writing is context specific. And here we need to talk about appropriateness and register. I don't know, teachers, if it's happened to you that your students at some point have maybe written something like gonna, Gonna, or wanna, Wanna, in some of their writing for your class. Maybe they have, because our students are exposed to a lot of internet language, right? And sometimes they don't know what language is appropriate for what genre of writing, right? So we need to help our students with things like that. We need to tell them, okay, this is good, gonna is fine, but it's okay for certain writing contexts, right? Like text messages or, I don't know, quick emails to a friend or something like that, right? Something very informal. Whereas in a more formal piece of writing, we have to use going to, for example, yeah? So this is all information that we need to take into consideration for our students. Okay. Now I would like to hear from you guys for a moment. I see you're participating a lot in the chat. Patricia, welcome. Nice to see you again. Cristina, Santi, Edison. Hello, Edison. Nice to see all of you guys. So please let us know, what writing topics have you enjoyed doing with your students? I want to hear what writing topics you guys have worked with students and that you feel have been successful with your students, so we can share some ideas. I think it's also important to mention in the chat, if you're going to share with us, what age you worked with that writing topic. Because obviously, if we're working with students who are 9 and 10 years old, we're not going to use the same topics as with university students, and for the most part, right? So tell us what age group you work with, and also what topic you've worked with for writing that you have found has been really interesting. Hello, Lourdes. Hello, Edward. Hello, Angela. Welcome, everybody who's just joining us. So go ahead and comment in the chat, please. Tell us what topics you've enjoyed doing with your students, because we're going to talk about how to determine a topic for writing, okay? So determining a writing prompt. What topics should we use with our students? There are some main things that we need to keep in mind. Lourdes, thank you. Writing about their dreams and desires. This is great. That's a good one. It's very personal for students. Okay, when we decide a topic for our students, we have to take into consideration some components, right? Age. What topics are relevant and appropriate for students of this age? And what topics are they interested in? Right? We're not going to have students write about something that is extremely boring for them, because they're not going to be motivated to write. So if we can find a topic that's at least remotely interesting for them and their age group, we might be more successful. Yeah. Jenny, for example, tell me about an amazing, fun, or awful experience. We all like to share our personal lives, our personal stories, right? Jenny's example is a good one. Good. Sophia, vertebrates in danger of extinction. That's good. Lourdes talks about future plans and future jobs. That's good. Wonderful. Okay. What else do we need to consider with writing prompts? Level. What are my students capable of producing, right? What do they have the language to be able to do? We can't ask them to write a persuasive essay, for example, if they're A1 level students. That's not possible, right? Even if they're university, we can't ask them to do that in English. So we always need to take into consideration what are their capacities linguistically speaking, right? Also the purpose. What do I want my students to do with this writing? What is my didactic goal? Do I really want them to focus on new vocabulary that they've been learning? Do I really want them to focus on grammar? Do I want them to focus on constructing an organized paragraph, for example, or an argumentative essay? It all depends on your didactic goal, right? And not every writing is going to have the same didactic goal. Not every time that you teach students writing or you do a writing lesson, you're going to focus on grammar specifically, right? Okay, we have some more ideas here for writing prompts. And so Edison says, with college students, I've used text containing narrative tenses. Okay. Describe a person you look up to, Jenny says. That's very nice. Good. All of these ideas are really nice, really, really good things for students to connect with. Because if they don't connect with the topic for the writing, they're not going to be very motivated to write, like we mentioned, right? Okay. All right, the planning part of the writing. I think most of you are familiar already with the typical brainstorming, right? The brainstorming can be done individually, in small groups, as a class, whatever works better for your particular scenario. Where I live in Ecuador, it's the case that in public institutions, their class sizes are usually between 40 and 50 students per classroom. And I know that's also the reality in Peru in many classes and in other countries around Latin America. In that case, it might be most effective to have students work in small groups to do brainstorming, and you as the teacher can walk around and monitor the process, right? Make sure that they're focused, they're on task, generating ideas. Writing does not have to be only an individual process. There can be portions of the writing that's a group process, and that's totally fine, right? Here's something that might be new for a lot of you, which is something we call the rhetorical problem. What do we mean by the rhetorical problem? It's not really a problem, right? It's just issues that we should take into consideration. So within the rhetorical problem, we have purpose. For example, what is the purpose of the writing? The likely audience. And we have to think beyond my English teacher. Yes, your English teacher will read your paper. But a lot of times when we contextualize writing, we say, for example, pretend you are going to write a letter to your school principal to suggest improvements in the school's infrastructure or something, right? Then the audience becomes the school principal, not your English teacher, right? So anytime we can establish a writing with a specific audience in mind, we are helping our students to guide them through the process so that they also have in mind that particular audience when they're doing the writing, okay? Obviously, the topic is part of the rhetorical problem. The writer's knowledge of the topic. Sometimes to write something, we need to do research. We don't know much about the topic. If you have students write about a holiday in the United States, for example, maybe they don't have a lot of background knowledge about that topic. So they need to go back and do research and figure out some things, right? So we have to take into consideration how much they already know, and also the writer's goal in writing. Do I want to be able to express myself clearly in English? Do I want to use complex sentences? Do I want to perfect my grammar, right? In a communicative approach, we know that accuracy is not as important, right? But maybe this is their focus. Maybe this is our particular student's focus. So we need to also take that into consideration, right? Okay, yes. Begin to organize the writing through, and here I say teacher guided outline. Our instructions as teachers are paramount. That means they're extremely important in the student's writing. Because if we don't if we don't scaffold the writing, right? If we don't say, okay, here, for example, in your topic sentence, I want to see this. In your next two sentences, I want to see this. You know, we have to give the instructions clear enough and organized enough so that we help the students to be able to structure the text, right? It's not sufficient to say, write a descriptive paragraph about your house. Students need more guidance than that, right? They need more instruction, more scaffolding. This is the word we could use, yeah? Okay. Okay, again, while executing the writing, a reminder that writing is a process, right? And there's no such thing as perfection in writing. And this is something that we should also keep in mind. I can tell you a brief anecdote from when I was a student in university. And I was studying in the United States, and my field of study was Spanish and French, right? And so I had a teacher, a professor, in my Spanish composition class, and I thought that I could write okay in Spanish. Like, I thought I was decent, right? I had come back from studying abroad for a year in Spain, and I said, okay, I've written papers in Spanish. I can do this, right? So I turned in like a very brief writing, maybe a page or 2 pages. And the teacher gave it back to me after my first draft. And all I saw all over the whole paper was red ink, red. And I said, oh my goodness, what happened? What happened to my writing? And I met with the professor. And I said, why is my writing so bad? And she said, your writing is not bad. She said, but writing is a process, and there's always room for improvement, and there's no such thing as perfection. So if you're expecting 100% with absolutely no marks on your paper, you're not going to have that the whole semester. And it was then that I understood that she was right. So I'm telling you the same thing. Writing is a process, and we can always improve on our writing. We can, our students can, even authors can, right? Okay. Also, I want to mention, to encourage students to work with their English toolbox. What do I mean by their English toolbox? I mean the grammar and vocabulary that students have within their grasp of English, right? So let's give an example here. Let's say that our students' toolbox in their native language, right? If it's Spanish or Arabic or whatever their native language is, because we have people from all over the world. Let's imagine that this is the size, you see this here, right? This is the size of their toolbox in their native language. It's very big, okay? These are all the linguistic tools they can work with in their native language. Compare that to the size of their English toolbox, which looks like this. You see the difference? Yeah. What do I want to say by this? I want to say that it's impossible to expect our students to produce something similar to what they can produce with this toolbox, only using this toolbox. You see? And they also need to know that, because our students get frustrated a lot thinking, I can't write, I can't do this, I want to say so many things, I want to express so many things, and I can't do it, especially in high school and university levels, because they're capable of writing formal business letters, for example, in their native language. But when they try to do it in English, it's very challenging for them. And even after years of study of a language, you'll still realize that it's still challenging. I've studied Spanish for, I don't know, technically over 30 years, I guess. I've been speaking Spanish. But it's still very difficult for me to write a business letter in Spanish, because I don't have all of that technical specific vocabulary exactly how native speakers will say it, right? So it's really important that our students, tell your students, give them this metaphor about toolboxes. Tell them, look, here's your Spanish toolbox, here's your English toolbox. I know that it's smaller. I want you to work with this. Don't try to take tools from here and put them in here, right? Because then they get really frustrated. Yeah, work with what they have. Okay, longer writing assignments should not be limited to one version. We can do 2 drafts, 3 drafts, 4 drafts, as many as you determine are appropriate. Allow some time to develop writing in class to monitor and process and give more individualized support and attention, especially with AI existing now. Since AI exists, we know that students can go and generate a paragraph, an essay, whatever, in ChatGPT or any other AI platform that they use. So if we can give them time to develop this in class with us being there, we have a little bit more of a guarantee that they're actually going through the writing process, right? And then encourage creativity whenever appropriate. I work in academia in the university, and a lot of times we forget about creativity. So allow your students to also write things that are creative. Give them something called a free write, okay? I'm giving all of you right now 10 minutes to free write. Teacher, what do we write about? Anything you want. Absolutely anything, right? That's called a free write. Let them just let their thoughts flow and put them down on paper, right? Okay. Let's continue. Let's see. Santi says, I start telling him to write sentences first, then paragraphs, and finally compositions, right? When writing sentences, students learn to join ideas with conjunctions and so on. Absolutely, right? So we start with the small pieces and then we continue to build from there. So yes, that's good. Okay, peer evaluation. Quick, really quick answer, teachers. Those of you who have your fingers on your keyboards or can type right away on your phones. When should peer evaluation be incorporated in the writing process? Right? So at what point do you think that it's most appropriate for us to incorporate peer evaluation? Peer evaluation, obviously, meaning when their classmates evaluate each other, right? When the students evaluate each other among their classmates. When do you think is the most appropriate time to incorporate peer evaluation in the writing process? Is it after the first draft? Is it after the second draft, right before the final draft? When do you think it's best? Yeah, let's give you a moment to think about it, and I'll continue with the other points that I have here. For peer evaluation to be successful, teachers must provide clear guidelines in the form of a questionnaire, in a rubric, something. Because it's not sufficient to tell students, evaluate your classmates' composition. You know the students, especially if they're high school students, they say, it's fine. And then they put, it's fine. That's it. Right? So it's our job to develop questions that are more specific. For example, does the student have an interesting title? Is the first sentence attention grabbing, for example? Is the paragraph structured in an organized way? Does the student use punctuation appropriately? Like all those things. We can develop it as a rubric. We can develop it as open-ended questions, yes, no, et cetera, et cetera. Okay. And then, of course, keep in mind the goal of the writing assignment to develop peer evaluation guidelines. What is my focus? Why did I make them write this? And I want to be consistent throughout. So if I tell them my emphasis is on new vocabulary, the peer review should also have something in it about new vocabulary, right? So we want to be consistent with our purpose and our evaluation throughout the process of writing. Yeah. Okay. Some of you are answering the question that I asked at the beginning of the slide. When should peer evaluation be incorporated? And Santi says, is it good to incorporate during or after writing? Okay, let's think about this in a logical way. In theory, right? In the classroom, we have a teacher and we have students, right? Who, in theory, knows more about writing in the English language? The teacher. So if I have the teacher intervene in the drafts before the students intervene, we might have a problem. Because if the teacher has already gone through correcting or changing or suggesting or whatever, what are the peers going to do? If it's already been revised by the teacher, the peers are going to say, I have nothing to do here. The teacher already told you what to do, right? This is why we would suggest that peer evaluation be incorporated, especially at the beginning of the process, after a first draft, because then you have equals who are evaluating each other. I mean, yes, you have students who are better and worse, of course, but they're all of the same group, right? They can evaluate each other first, offer suggestions. If they see things that should be corrected, they can take a look at those. And then after the writer does the incorporations of the changes or suggestions that their peers make, then we can present a draft to the teacher, right? This makes the most sense. I think Edison has an important comment where he says along the whole writing process, yes, we can involve them in different ways. We can have peers focus on different things. Maybe the first draft, we have them focus on vocabulary, grammar, and mechanics, but maybe the next draft, we have them focus on content and organization or something. We can do it that way, yes. But in most cases, it's most appropriate to incorporate it before the teacher's revisions come, okay? All right, speaking of revisions and evaluating writing, this is a big challenge we have in the field of English language teaching. So share with us, please, what are some techniques that you have found effective to correct your students' writing? I want to know what you guys have done in the past that you especially consider to be effective and like techniques that help your students to correct their writing. Okay, so go ahead and comment in the chat as we move along with this. Okay. Evaluating a first draft. Yeah. So we have some key points to keep in mind when we evaluate a first draft. Again, the purpose of the writing assignment. Why did I make my students do this? Because I need to be consistent. If I made it clear at the beginning that I'm focusing on new vocabulary, in my evaluation, I need to be consequential. I need to show that I'm evaluating new vocabulary, right? Okay. Give feedback on a macro and micro level. What do I mean by macro and micro level? Micro level, we do all the time. We as teachers, I think, are programmed to correct grammar, to correct spelling, to correct punctuation, and all of that fun stuff that we as teachers really love, right? Okay, that's a micro level. That's a word by word level, yeah? But what about the macro level? And this is something that we tend to forget about as teachers. What do I mean by the macro level? The content of the writing, the organization of the writing, the bigger picture, right? Not the comma that's missing on line 3, but like, okay, this is a descriptive paragraph. Does it do a good job of describing? Can I follow the description? Are there good adjectives in this paragraph? Does it make sense? Did it comply with what I asked for, right? But from a macro level, the content of it. Yeah, so we cannot forget about those things because a lot of times we focus on the mechanics and the grammar of language and we forget about the communication part, right? The writing part itself. Okay, some of you are sharing your ideas for correction. Yes, Lourdes says I have my students correct in pairs first and then I give them feedback so then they can write their final version, right? Okay, that's good. So they correct in pairs first, peer review first. Edison says clear rubrics with achievement objectives. Students know them well in advance. Absolutely, it's super important to let your students know the rubrics in advance so that they know how they will be evaluated. Yes, thank you very much, Edison, for that comment. No matter what your technique, I have sad news. I have sad news. Scientific research shows that in general, overt correction does not stick long term. In other words, all of the time and effort and energy we put into correcting those drafts to make our students see where they're wrong in the language doesn't actually have an effect in their long-term production of English. They forget or they don't internalize our corrections, right? This is true in the case of writing, and it's also true in the case of speaking. That doesn't mean we don't have to do anything, right? We still have to, we have to do something. We have to correct them, but maybe we should be doing it in a way that's not so time consuming. Yeah. Give responsibility to students to fix errors and mistakes, and consider your words and your pen color. I know this sounds a little superficial, but color matters. There are studies that have been done about red pen and the negative effects it has on students. So I think if we can choose a color other than red, that's a good idea, yeah? Let me tell you about a technique that I used to use in my own classes. When I lived in Chicago, which is where I'm from originally, I used to teach Spanish. And I taught Spanish to heritage speakers of Spanish. In other words, sons and daughters of Spanish-speaking immigrants in the United States. So these were Mexican Americans from everywhere, Peru, Ecuador, okay. But they were born in the United States. So they knew Spanish, they could speak Spanish, they could have a conversation, but writing Spanish was very difficult for them. So what did I do? With their drafts, I used to use 5 colors of highlighters. Yeah, pink, yellow, green, blue, and purple. And each color of highlighter represented a different category. I still remember this. Pink was accent mark. The accent mark was wrong. It was missing, whatever. Yellow was spelling. Green was Spanglish, because sometimes they wrote using phrases like a mix of English and Spanish. Blue was verb form, and purple was miscellaneous. So why did I like to do this system? Number one, because aesthetically it's pleasing. When they receive their drafts, even if they have a lot of marks on it, what they see are pastel colors in a rainbow. They don't see red all over their paper, right? So aesthetically, it makes them happier, let's say, or more willing to correct their work. And second, because from a first glance, the students could see where they needed to really focus their effort. So for example, if a student got a paper back and they looked at their paper and they said, oh my goodness, my paper is so pink, I need to work on my accent marks in Spanish, right? Or, oh my goodness, my paper is so yellow. I need to fix my spelling. I need to pay attention to my spelling, right? That way students have a better idea from a macro level where their difficulties are in the language when they're writing, yeah? And students really like to work with this. It gave them enough guidance where they didn't change a whole sentence if they were just missing an accent mark. But at the same time, I didn't correct it for them. They had to figure out what was the problem, but I guided them as far as like what type of problem it was. A lot of times we use symbols, yeah, like P or V for verb form, things like that. That also works. It's the same idea, yeah? Okay. Okay, we're coming towards the end here. Rubrics for writing. There, I noticed on the RELO Facebook page that there is already a webinar done on rubrics. So I encourage you guys to look at that. It's from several months ago now, but there's one done on rubrics that's on the RELO page if you want to know more specifics about rubrics. But there are a couple things that we need to take into consideration every time we do a rubric. First, again, what is the purpose of the writing? Why do I keep mentioning this? Because the rubric needs to be consequential, right? If what is the purpose of the writing? If I'm, for example, focusing on trying to get students to persuade with a written argument, I better have a category on my rubric that focuses on that specifically, that gives value to that, right? What did you emphasize in class? Maybe in the last couple weeks, you've been working a lot with punctuation with your students in your classes. How about giving punctuation more weight in this rubric? Because that's what you've been working on, right? Maybe you've been working a lot on spelling. Maybe you've been working a lot on grammar, whatever it is, right? You want to also transfer that to your rubric so that it appears in the evaluation. We have to remember that not all categories need to be worth the same amount of points. Sometimes teachers think, okay, my rubric is 20 points. So I have 5 categories. Each category is 4 points. Yes, you can do that. But if you really want to emphasize a particular category, like I mentioned, because this is the purpose, because this has been your focus in class, you can do that. So of a rubric of a total of 20 points, maybe you decide to give 10 points to organization or to vocabulary. That's fine. You can do that and have the other categories be worth 2, 3, 4, whatever you decide. Right? So no, there's no written law that says every category must be of equal value. It depends on your focus, right? And it's also very important for us to give objective and specific descriptions for the rubric, because evaluating writing can become very subjective and students can argue their grades, right? And they can say, why did I get this grade instead of this grade? That's why it's super important for us to develop rubrics that, yes, have categories with point values, but also what does it mean if in organization you get a 5 and you don't get a 3, or vice versa, right? If you get in vocabulary, what does it mean if you end up with a 2 instead of a 4? Why did you get a 2? So it's very important to justify those point values to make something that's very subjective become a little bit more objective. Yeah. Okay. To finish off this talk about writing, I want to talk about writing as a game. So we have a lot of online resources that turn writing into games, right? All you have to do, it's very simple. Is go to Google or any other search engine that you use and search for writing games for EFL learners. And you'll find a lot of writing games online or ones that you can transfer to the classroom environment. These are a couple that I've worked with that I think are fun for students, and maybe some of you have worked with them too. If you've worked with other writing games, please let us know in the chat, share them with us so we all know, we can know what kind of games you work with. But here are 2 of them, Mad Libs. Mad Libs is something that's existed for years, but it's still a lot of fun. Now there's an online version, of course, but so what you have students do is essentially create a short story about anything, a short story, right? And in the story, they leave spaces for like an adjective or a verb or something like that, a noun, different parts of speech, okay? So they create the story, they're writing the story, like for example, one day John went to a blank adjective park, yeah? And then they'll be with a partner, right? And so on another piece of paper, the student writes, okay, number 1, I want an adjective. Number 2, I want a plural noun. Number 3, a preposition, not a preposition, like for example, an adverb, right? Number 4, a proper noun, etc. Yeah. And then they give that paper to a partner. The partner writes down, fills in like an adjective, a noun, etc. And then they put all of those into the story that the student was writing, and vice versa, because they're each writing their own story, right? And so then you can complete the story, and it ends up being very funny because they don't know the context of the story. They don't know what's happening. So sometimes they end up with sentences that are very silly. They're grammatical, but they're nonsensical. And it's fun, and the students laugh with it and things like that. So that's a lot of fun. Another example of a game that we can play with writing is called a folding story. All you need for this is one piece of paper for the whole class, right? So you start, the teacher can start the story. They can start a story and say, once upon a time, there was a little dog named Lucas, for example. You write one line, yeah? But literally one line on the piece of paper. And then the next person, the teacher gives it to a student. The student reads that line, and then they write a line underneath. They continue the story, right? But after the student writes their line, they fold the paper down to cover the previous line. You understand? So that at any given moment that the class is developing the story together, all the student can see is the last line that was written. So you end up having a story that's very, again, it's like a Frankenstein, but it's silly and it's fun for them, and it gets them into at least writing. And then someone at the end, when we've gone through all of the students and each student has written a line to the story, someone reads the story out loud. It can be the teacher, it can be a student, whoever, but they read the story that they've created out loud to the class. And students enjoy this. They have a good time doing these games. So it's really entertaining for them. It's really, it gets them motivated to write, you know, and lowers those affective filters like we've talked about before. So, okay, that's all I have for you guys today. I just want to conclude with this quote by Martin Luther that says, if you want to change the world, pick up your pen and write. You guys can be great examples for your students if you show them you also write in English. They'll be inspired by your writing, and they'll also continue to write in the English language themselves. So thank you so much, teachers. Please don't forget to join me today on our Zoom session at 3 p.m. in 20 minutes. If any of you are free, on the Facebook page, you will see the Zoom link. You can join us on that link, and we can continue to discuss writing, share your ideas with me, share all of our ideas together. I would be happy to meet you guys, not in person, but at least over the computer. That would be great. So thank you very much for attending today, and I look forward to seeing you guys next month. Take care. Bye.